The Arizona Territory in the year 1867 was a land that God had sketched but never finished. It stretched beneath a sun that burned with the fury of a blacksmith's forge, endless and merciless, turning the earth to dust and the hearts of men to something harder than stone. This was a place where the Civil War's echo still rang in the empty arroyos, where deserters and dreamers alike came seeking redemption or riches, often finding neither. The territory would not become a state for another 45 years, and in those days it existed in a kind of limbo, a purgatory of sand and sage where the laws of man held little sway, and the laws of nature held even less. In the southeastern corner of this unforgiving expanse, where the Dragoon Mountains rose like broken teeth against the horizon, there existed a settlement that appeared on no official map. The locals called it Esperanza, though hope was the last thing anyone found there. It consisted of perhaps 30 structures, most of them leaning at angles that defied understanding, their weathered boards gray as old bone. A single street of packed earth ran through the center, flanked by a general store, a saloon with no name, a livery stable that smelled of death and hay in equal measure, and a tiny adobe church whose cross had fallen and never been replaced. The population fluctuated between 40 and 60 souls, depending on whether you counted the prospectors who drifted in and out like tumbleweeds, chasing rumors of silver in the surrounding hills. It was in this place, in the autumn of that year when the heat finally broke and the nights grew cold enough to see your breath, that a man named Josiah Crane arrived carrying nothing but a battered leather satchel and a brass lantern. He came on foot, walking the final 12 miles from the stage stop at Tombstone, appearing out of the desert haze one afternoon like something conjured from the dust itself. Those who saw him approach remarked later on his appearance, though their descriptions varied. Some said he was tall, others that he was of average height. Some remembered him as young, perhaps 30, while others swore he had the weathered face of a man who had seen 50 winters. What everyone agreed upon was the lantern. It hung from his right hand, suspended by a curved handle, and even in the bright afternoon sun they could see the flame flickering inside its glass chamber, a small tongue of orange light that seemed somehow brighter than it should have been. Josiah Crane took a room above the general store, paying for a month in advance with coins that felt cold even in the desert heat. The proprietor, a widow named Margaret Flynn who had buried 3 husbands and expected to bury a 4th if she ever found one foolish enough to marry her, asked him his business in Esperanza. Crane told her he was a surveyor, come to map the mineral deposits in the Dragoons. It was a common enough story, and Margaret asked no more questions, though she noticed that the man never set down his lantern, not even when he carried his satchel up the narrow stairs to his room. Margaret had seen many strange men pass through Esperanza in her 15 years there. She had seen gamblers with hollow eyes and preachers with conviction that bordered on madness. She had seen soldiers still fighting wars that had ended years ago, and prospectors chasing dreams that had died before they were born. But there was something different about Josiah Crane, something that made her skin prickle when he stood too close, that made the air in the room feel thinner when he was present. She could not name it, could not even properly describe it to herself, but it was there nonetheless, a wrongness that existed just beneath the surface of his unremarkable appearance. Her first husband had been a good man who died of cholera in the crossing from Missouri. Her second had been a drunk who fell from his horse and broke his neck on a rock. Her third had been mean, and she had been glad when the Apaches took him, though she never said so aloud. Each death had taught her something about survival, about the necessity of hardness in a hard land, and her hardness now told her to refuse Crane the room, to turn him away, to send him back into the desert from which he had come. But business was business, and the coins he placed on her counter were real enough even if they felt wrong in ways she could not articulate. She heard his footsteps overhead for hours that first night, pacing back and forth, and she saw through the cracks in the ceiling boards a warm glow that never dimmed, never flickered, never went out. The settlement fell into its usual rhythms around the newcomer. Men worked their small claims in the hills, returning at dusk covered in red dust and disappointment. Women tended gardens that struggled in the alkaline soil, washing clothes in water that had to be hauled from a well that was running drier each year. Children played in the street, their games violent and strange, shaped by the harsh landscape that surrounded them. And Josiah Crane walked among them like a ghost, always carrying that lantern, always keeping to himself, speaking only when spoken to, and even then, in sentences so brief, they seemed calculated to discourage further conversation. But people noticed things. They noticed that Crane never bought lamp oil from the general store, though his lantern burned day and night. They noticed that he took his meals at odd hours, appearing at the saloon when it was nearly empty, eating quickly and without apparent pleasure, then returning to his room where the light continued its eternal vigil. They noticed that he made no effort to survey anything, carried no instruments, drew no maps, asked no questions about mineral deposits or promising veins of ore. And they noticed, though it took several weeks for anyone to mention it aloud, that the flame in his lantern never changed. It did not gutter in the wind. It did not brighten when fresh oil should have been added. It simply burned, constant and unwavering, as if fed by something other than kerosene. The first person to speak of it openly was a prospector named Dutch Henry, a man whose real name no one knew, and whose grip on sanity had been loosened by too many years alone in the desert. Dutch Henry had come to the territory in 1861, following the first silver strikes, and he had never left. He lived in a shack made of salvaged wood and canvas 3 miles outside Esperanza, returning to town only when his supplies ran low or his loneliness became unbearable. His face was burned the color of old leather by the sun, and his eyes had taken on the peculiar quality of men who spend too much time staring at horizons, a kind of distant focus that made conversation with him unsettling. People said that Dutch Henry had been different when he first arrived, that he had been young and hopeful and full of plans. They said he had a wife waiting for him back east, that he wrote her letters describing the fortune he would make and the life they would build together. But the letters had stopped coming back after the first year, and eventually Dutch Henry stopped writing them. He stopped talking about going home. He stopped talking about much of anything except the silver he would find any day now. Any day, just one more hole in the ground, one more tunnel into the mountain. He cornered several men in the saloon one night, his breath heavy with whiskey that he had bought with the last of his money, and told them he had followed Crane into the hills that afternoon. His hands shook as he spoke, and his voice had the quality of a man trying to convince himself of something he desperately wanted to disbelieve. He said he had been checking his traps in the foothills when he saw Crane walking up a narrow trail, moving with purpose, the lantern swinging from his hand even though it was midday, and the sun was bright enough to hurt the eyes. Curiosity had compelled Dutch Henry to follow, staying far enough back that Crane would not notice but close enough to track his progress. The trail led up into rocky country where only scorpions and rattlesnakes thrived, where the stones themselves seemed to radiate heat like coals in a fire. Crane climbed without apparent effort, never pausing to rest or wipe the sweat from his face, moving as if pulled by invisible strings. And Dutch Henry followed, his own breath coming hard, his heart pounding in his chest, some part of him screaming to turn back, even as his feet continued to carry him forward. He watched from a distance as the stranger climbed to a small cave in the foothills of the Dragoons, a dark mouth in the rock that Dutch Henry had seen before, but never entered. There were stories about that cave, old stories that predated the Mexican occupation, stories told by the Apache about a place where the earth breathed darkness and the stones remembered things that should be forgotten. Crane entered it without hesitation, and the light from his lantern was swallowed by the darkness within, absorbed so completely that Dutch Henry could not see even a faint glow from the entrance. He waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. The sun tracked across the sky and the shadows lengthened, and Dutch Henry remained in his hiding place among the rocks, unable to leave, compelled to witness whatever would emerge from that cave. And when Crane finally appeared, stepping back into the daylight with the lantern still burning in his hand, Dutch Henry swore the flame was different. It was brighter, yes, impossibly bright. So bright it hurt to look at directly even though it was contained within glass. But more than that, it seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was biological, that suggested a heartbeat or breathing, that implied life in something that should have been merely fire and fuel. The men listened to Dutch Henry's story with the skepticism reserved for drunkards and madmen, nodding politely while exchanging glances that said they had heard enough of his ravings for one night. But Dutch Henry pressed on, his voice growing more desperate, describing how he had heard sounds coming from inside the cave while Crane was within it, sounds like weeping or perhaps singing in a language he did not recognize. He described how the ground around the cave entrance seemed to shimmer in the heat, how the air smelled of sulfur and something else, something sweet and rotten like flowers left too long in the sun. He described how Crane had stood at the cave mouth for a long moment before descending, staring into the darkness as if listening to a voice only he could hear, and how when he finally turned away, his shadow fell wrong on the rocks, too long in some places and too short in others, bending at angles that defied the sun's position in the sky. The men listened to Dutch Henry's story with the skepticism reserved for drunkards and madmen, but that night, several of them found themselves lying awake, listening to the wind scrape across the roof tiles, thinking about that unwavering flame. Over the following days, others began to share their own observations. The blacksmith mentioned that he had never seen Crane's shadow fall quite right, that it seemed too long at midday and too short at dusk. A young woman who helped her mother with washing claimed she had passed Crane on the street at dawn and seen that his eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's eyes, copper bright and unsettling. And Margaret Flynn, who slept in a room directly below Crane's, confessed that she had not had a peaceful night's sleep since the man arrived, that she dreamed of vast spaces underground, of tunnels that went down and down forever, of a light at the bottom that called to her in her dead husband's voice. 6 weeks after Josiah Crane's arrival, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night, and the first real cold of autumn settled over Esperanza. Men who had slept under thin blankets now piled on every covering they owned, and those who had firewood burned it gratefully. The change in weather seemed to affect Crane in a way that nothing else had. People saw him standing in the street at dawn, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, staring at his lantern with an expression that might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. He stopped taking meals at the saloon. He stopped appearing in public at all, except for brief excursions to the well where he would fill a bucket with water and carry it back to his room, the lantern swinging from his other hand. It was during this period that a Mexican woman named Esperanza, for whom the settlement had been named decades earlier, began to tell stories. She was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles, her memory stretching back to a time before the Americans came, when this land belonged to Spain, and then to Mexico, and the names on the maps changed, but the desert remained the same. She lived in a small adobe house at the edge of the settlement, surviving on charity and the sale of herbs that she gathered in the mountains, plants whose uses she knew from knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to read the desert like a book. Her real name was Esperanza Maria Magdalena Reyes de la Cruz, and she remembered when this place had been called something else, something in the language of the Odom people who had lived here before her people came, and before them, the ancient ones whose names were not even remembered. She had been a girl when the first American settlers arrived, full of their manifest destiny and their hunger for land. She had been a woman when the war came and went and came again. She had been old when the silver was discovered, and the prospectors flooded in like locusts. And she had been ancient when Josiah Crane walked into Esperanza carrying his cursed lantern, though the moment she saw him, she felt a recognition that transcended the boundaries of her individual life, as if her bones themselves remembered something her mind had never known. She told of lights in the desert, of flames that burned without fuel, of compacts made with things that lived in the deep places of the earth. She spoke in Spanish and sometimes in older languages, mixing her words with gestures that seemed to come from a tradition even she did not fully understand. She told of a tribe that had lived in these mountains centuries ago, before the Apache, before the O'odham, before anyone whose name was remembered. This tribe, she said, had worshipped something that dwelled in the caves, something that had been old when the first humans walked upright, something that had seen empires rise and fall and meant no more by them than a man means by the ants that cross his path. The thing in the cave, Esperanza said, was neither God nor devil but something that existed in the spaces between such concepts. It was hunger made manifest, desire given form, the distillation of every living thing's need for warmth and light in a world of cold darkness. It could not be killed because it had never been alive. It could not be banished because it had nowhere to go, being as much a part of the earth as the stone itself. It could only be appeased, fed, given what it required in exchange for what it offered. The ancient tribe had discovered this thing in their search for shelter during a particularly brutal winter, when their usual hunting grounds had been buried under snow and their people were starving. They had found the caves and gone deep into them, seeking protection from the wind, and in the deepest chamber they had found something that offered them warmth. It was a small flame, burning in the darkness without any visible source, and around it the air was warm enough to melt ice. They had gathered around this flame and felt their frozen limbs thaw, their hope return, their will to survive rekindled. But the flame required payment. It whispered to them in dreams, showing them what it needed. Hope, it said. Bring me hope. The hope of those who believe they will see another spring, who trust that their children will survive, who dare to imagine a future. And the tribe, desperate and grateful, had complied. They had brought their sick and their weak, those who clung most fiercely to hope despite having the least reason for it, and they had given them to the flame, not their bodies but their essence, the spark that kept them believing in tomorrow. And the flame had grown brighter with each offering, and the tribe had survived the winter, though those who had been offered to the flame survived as well, at least in body. They continued to walk and talk and perform the necessary functions of life, but they felt nothing. They hoped for nothing. They were shells, animated by habit rather than desire. This had continued for generations, Esperanza said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made the men lean forward to hear. The tribe had prospered in material terms, never suffering from cold or want, always guided by the flame's light through the darkest seasons. But they had withered in ways that were harder to measure. Their songs became mechanical recitations. Their children were born but not truly alive. Their old died without regret and without having truly lived. And eventually, the tribe itself had faded, not destroyed by war or plague, but simply ceasing to exist, the last of them walking into the desert one day and never returning, seeking in death the warmth they had long ago traded away in life. The caves had remained, Esperanza said, and the flame within them, waiting for the next desperate soul to stumble across it and make the same bargain. Over the centuries there had been many. Spanish conquistadors seeking gold, French trappers fleeing winter storms, Apache warriors wounded in battle, American soldiers lost in hostile territory. Each had found the flame. Each had been offered the bargain. Some had refused and died of their natural afflictions. Others had accepted and carried the curse forward, bearing lanterns that never went out, spreading a spiritual winter wherever they went, feeding the flame with the hope they stole from those around them. Josiah Crane, Esperanza said with certainty that came from some deep knowing, was only the latest in this long line of the cursed. He carried the flame because it had once saved his life, and now his life was not his own to live. He was a vessel, a host, a means by which the hunger expressed itself in the world, and he had come to Esperanza because the thing in the caves had drawn him here, back to its source, either to make his final offering or to receive final judgment on the bargain he had made. The old woman's story spread through Esperanza like fever. Parents warned their children to stay away from Josiah Crane. Men began to avoid him entirely, crossing the street when they saw him coming. And in the general store, Margaret Flynn sold out of salt and iron nails, items that were said to ward off evil, though whether anyone truly believed this or simply found comfort in the ritual, none could say. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday, the 21st of November, and the temperature had dropped below freezing for the first time that season. The sky was clear, filled with stars so numerous they seemed to touch one another, creating a dome of cold light above the sleeping settlement. Most people had retired early, seeking warmth beneath their blankets, and the street lay empty and silent. But Margaret Flynn could not sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the footsteps above her, the endless pacing that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, and she found herself counting the steps. 12 paces from the door to the window. A pause. 12 paces back. Another pause. Over and over, hour after hour, and she realized with a sick feeling in her stomach that she could time her own breathing to those footsteps, that they had become synchronized with the rhythm of her life. At some point past midnight, the pacing stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret sat up in bed, straining her ears, wondering if Crane had finally succumbed to sleep. But then she heard something else, a sound like sobbing or laughter, she could not tell which, and beneath it a low humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The light that usually leaked through the ceiling boards grew brighter, so bright that her room was illuminated as if by noon sun, and she could see every detail of her sparse furnishings, every crack in the plaster, every cobweb in the corners. She rose from her bed, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. The light was coming from beneath Crane's door, a brilliant white glow that hurt her eyes. She raised her hand to knock, hesitated, then pressed her ear against the rough wood. The humming was louder here, and she could hear words within it, though they were in no language she recognized. They rose and fell like a chant or a prayer, desperate and pleading, and beneath them she heard another voice, deeper and colder, responding in syllables that seemed to carry weight, as if each sound had physical mass. The wood beneath her ear was warm, warmer than it should have been, and she could feel it vibrating with the rhythm of that inhuman voice. The grain of the wood seemed to pulse, and when she pulled back to look at it in the fierce light bleeding under the door, she thought she saw patterns forming in the whorls and knots, geometries that hurt to look at, shapes that suggested meanings she could not quite grasp, but which filled her with a dread so profound it felt like drowning. She stood there for a length of time she could not measure, her hand raised to knock but frozen in place, her breath coming in short gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. Part of her mind screamed at her to flee, to run down the stairs and out into the night and keep running until she reached Tombstone or Tucson, or some place where the sun always shone and shadows fell as they should. But another part of her, the part that had survived 3 husbands and a decade and a half in the hardest territory in America, demanded that she know, that she understand, that she face whatever was behind that door with her eyes open. Margaret Flynn would later say that she did not consciously decide to open the door, that her hand moved of its own accord, turning the handle and pushing inward. The hinges made no sound. The door swung open on darkness that the brilliant light somehow did not penetrate, and for a moment she saw nothing, only that impossible contradiction of blazing illumination that revealed nothing. Then her eyes adjusted, or perhaps the darkness relented, and she saw. The room was larger than it should have been. The walls had receded somehow, or perhaps they had never been as close as she remembered. The ceiling stretched upward into shadows that the light from the lantern could not touch. The floor beneath her feet felt less solid than it had moments ago, as if the boards had become membrane, something that might tear or give way at any moment. And in the center of this transformed space, Josiah Crane knelt before his lantern like a penitent before an altar. But the lantern had changed beyond anything natural. It had grown, or perhaps it was simply that the flame within it had expanded until it dominated the glass chamber entirely, pressing against the metal framework, bulging the glass outward in ways that should have shattered it. The flame itself was no longer orange or yellow, but a white so pure it seemed to erase color from the world around it. And within that white fire, shapes moved. She saw faces, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. They were layered one upon another like pages in a book, each one distinct and each one expressing a suffering so complete it transcended the physical. They were not burning, not in the conventional sense. They were being consumed by something more fundamental than fire, unmade and remade in endless repetition, their essences used as fuel for a hunger that could never be satisfied. She recognized some of them, though she could not have said how. They were strangers to her, people from other times and other places. But in their expressions she saw a universal quality of betrayal and regret, the look of those who had bargained poorly and understood their mistake too late. Crane's lips moved in continuous prayer or incantation, his voice joining with those from within the flame, becoming part of the chorus of the damned. His eyes were fixed on those shapes with a hunger that was terrible to witness, and Margaret understood in that moment that he was not their victim, but their willing participant. He fed them his remaining hope, his last shreds of humanity, and they in turn fed something else, something that watched from deeper in the flame, something with eyes older than stone. What she saw in that room would haunt her for the rest of her days. Josiah Crane knelt in the center of the floor, his face turned toward the lantern which sat before him like an altarpiece. But the lantern had changed. The flame within it had grown until it filled the entire glass chamber, and within that flame she could see shapes moving, human forms that writhed and reached out as if trapped behind an invisible barrier. Crane's lips moved in continuous prayer or incantation, and his eyes were fixed on those shapes with a hunger that was terrible to witness. But worse than this, worse than anything Margaret had seen in her long and difficult life, was what surrounded the lantern. The wooden floor beneath it had burned away, revealing earth, and from that earth rose a darkness that was somehow visible, a blackness that seemed to pulse and breathe. It spread from the lantern like roots or veins, creeping across the floor, climbing the walls, reaching toward the ceiling, and where it touched wood, the wood aged and crumbled. Where it touched metal, the metal corroded and flaked. It was a corruption, a rot, something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. Crane must have sensed her presence because his head turned with a movement too quick to be natural, and he looked at her with eyes that were no longer entirely human. The pupils had elongated, become vertical slits, and the whites had taken on a yellowish cast. His mouth opened, and the voice that emerged was his butt layered with others, a chorus of the damned. He told her to leave. He told her to run. He told her that what she had seen could not be unseen, that the knowledge of it would corrupt her as surely as the darkness corrupted the wood. And Margaret Flynn, who had faced down Apache raiders and outlaw gangs and the death of everyone she had ever loved, found herself paralyzed by a fear so profound it seemed to stop her heart. She stood in that doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, watching as Josiah Crane turned back to his devotions and the flame in the lantern grew brighter still. How long she stood there, she could never say. It might have been seconds or hours, but eventually her body obeyed the ancient imperative to survive, and she stumbled backward, pulled the door shut, and fled down the stairs. She did not stop running until she reached the church, that small adobe structure with its fallen cross, and she pounded on the door until the priest, a young man named Father Michael who had come west to save souls and found mostly emptiness, answered in his nightshirt. She told him everything she had seen, the words tumbling out in a rush, and she expected him to dismiss her as mad or drunk or both. But Father Michael listened with an expression of growing horror, and when she finished, he crossed himself and whispered a prayer in Latin. He told her that he had suspected something was wrong with Josiah Crane from the moment he saw him, that there was an absence around the man, a void where grace should have been. He had been too afraid to act on this suspicion, had told himself he was imagining things, but now he knew the truth. Together, they roused the settlement. Men emerged from their homes carrying rifles and lanterns of their own, their faces hard with determination that masked their terror. Women gathered the children and barricaded themselves in the church, reciting prayers they half remembered from childhood. And this makeshift militia made its way through the frozen streets to the general store, their breath forming clouds, their footsteps crunching on frost. They found Josiah Crane's door locked from the inside. The light that had been so brilliant an hour ago had dimmed to a faint glow. When they broke down the door, they discovered Crane lying on the floor beside his lantern, eyes open and staring at the ceiling, a slight smile on his lips. He was dead. There was no wound, no sign of violence, no indication of what had killed him. His body was simply empty, as if his soul had been extracted like water from a well. The lantern sat beside him, its flame still burning, steady and unwavering. Father Michael approached the lantern with his crucifix held before him like a weapon. He reached out to extinguish it, but Dutch Henry grabbed his arm, warning him not to touch it, saying that some fires were not meant to be put out by mortal hands. The men argued in harsh whispers, standing over Crane's corpse until Margaret Flynn suggested they simply take the body and the lantern both, bury them together, let the earth deal with whatever evil had taken root here. And so they did. They wrapped Josiah Crane in a sheet and carried him to the small cemetery on the edge of town, a plot of hard ground where a dozen wooden crosses marked the graves of those who had sought fortune in the desert and found only an early death. They dug a hole 6 feet deep, working in the pre-dawn cold, their shovels ringing against stones. They placed Crane's body in the ground, and beside it they placed the lantern, still burning, its flame visible even in the growing light of morning. Father Michael spoke words from the Bible, committing the stranger's soul to whatever judgment awaited it, and the men filled the grave with earth. They piled stones on top, heavy rocks from the surrounding hills, enough weight to prevent anything from clawing its way back up. And then they stood in silence, watching the mound of earth, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The sun rose. The desert warmed. The day proceeded as days do. People returned to their routines, though they moved through them mechanically, their minds still fixed on what they had witnessed. Margaret Flynn opened her store but made no sales. Men went to their claims but did no work. The children remained in the church, sensing their parents' unease even if they did not understand its source. That night, as darkness fell and the temperature dropped once more, someone noticed a glow coming from the cemetery. At first they thought it was a trick of the moonlight, a reflection off the stones, but as they watched, the glow grew brighter, and they realized with mounting dread that it was coming from beneath the ground, from Crane's grave, where the lantern continued to burn 6 feet below the surface. A group of men went to investigate, carrying their own lanterns and weapons they knew would be useless against whatever they might find. They stood around the grave and saw that the earth itself had begun to glow, a faint phosphorescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. The stones they had piled on top had shifted, not dramatically but enough to notice, as if something beneath them was breathing, and from the cracks between the stones came a thin stream of smoke or steam, carrying a smell like burning hair and sulfur. Dutch Henry suggested they dig up the body, extinguish the lantern properly, and rebury it with salt and iron. Others argued against disturbing the grave, saying that some things were better left buried. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling, fear making men angry and anger making them reckless. Finally, Father Michael declared that they would wait until morning, that they would watch the grave through the night, and if the lantern still burned at dawn, they would take more drastic action. So they kept vigil. They built fires in a circle around the cemetery, more for comfort than warmth, and they took turns standing guard while others dozed fitfully. The night was long and cold, and filled with sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else. The glow from the grave never dimmed. If anything, it grew brighter as the hours passed, until it cast shadows among the crosses, shadows that moved when nothing visible moved. Dawn came gray and reluctant. The men were exhausted, their faces drawn, their eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. But the lantern still burned beneath the earth, visible as a soft radiance that seemed to mock their efforts. Father Michael led them in prayer, then blessed a shovel with holy water and began to dig. Others joined him, working in relays, removing the stones and then the earth they had so recently replaced. When they reached the depth where Crane's body should have been, they found only the lantern. The corpse was gone. The sheet that had wrapped it lay empty and torn, shredded as if by claws or teeth. The lantern sat in a small hollow it had burned into the earth, its flame as steady as ever, and around it the soil had been transformed into something like glass, smooth and black and slightly warm to the touch. The men recoiled in horror. Several made the sign of the cross. One vomited into the bushes. Dutch Henry laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and said he had known this would happen, that you could not kill what had never truly lived. Father Michael lifted the lantern from its hollow with shaking hands, holding it at arm's length, and as he raised it into the morning light, they all saw what had been invisible in darkness. Inside the glass chamber, within the flame itself, was a face. It was Josiah Crane's face, but also the faces of others, dozens or perhaps hundreds of them, layered one atop another like pages in a book. They shifted and changed, expressing agony and ecstasy in equal measure, mouths open in silent screams or songs. And at the center of this mass of humanity was something else, something that was not human and never had been, a darkness with eyes that looked out at the world with ancient hunger. Father Michael dropped the lantern. It should have shattered on the rocky ground, but it did not. It bounced once, twice, and came to rest upright, the flame still burning. No one moved to pick it up. They stood in a circle around it, these hard men of the frontier, these survivors who had seen death in all its forms, and they did not know what to do. The desert wind picked up, moaning through the cemetery, scattering dust across the graves, and the lantern's flame bent with it, but did not go out. It was old Esperanza who finally came forward. She had walked from the settlement, following the men at a distance, and now she pushed through the circle to stand before the lantern. She spoke to it in Spanish, then in a language even older, words that sounded like water over stone. She told it that its time in this place was finished, that it could not feed here anymore, that the people of this land would not make the bargains it required. And whether the thing inside the lantern understood her or simply recognized in her voice something older than itself, the flame began to dim. It happened slowly at first, then faster. The faces within the flame faded like photographs in sunlight. The glass chamber grew dark, the metal cooled, and when the last flicker died, the lantern became simply an object, brass and glass and nothing more. The weight of centuries lifted from it, and it sat in the dirt like any other relic of human manufacture. But the men of Esperanza knew better than to trust this apparent peace. They took the lantern and buried it again, this time at a crossroads 3 miles from town, where 4 paths met and travelers left offerings to ensure safe passage. They marked the spot with a cairn of white stones and told everyone who asked that it was a grave, though they never said whose. And they warned their children and their children's children never to dig there, never to disturb what lay beneath. For 2 more days and nights, witnesses claimed to see a glow at that crossroads, faint but unmistakable, as if the lantern burned still beneath the earth, refusing to acknowledge its extinction. Some said they heard voices carried on the wind, pleading or cursing in languages no living person spoke. Others reported dreams of being underground, of following a light through endless tunnels, of finding at the end a room where all the lost souls of the world gathered around a flame that promised warmth but delivered only consumption. On the 3rd day, the glow faded, the voices ceased, the desert reclaimed its silence, and life in Esperanza returned to its normal rhythms of hardship and survival, though those who had witnessed the events of those November days were never quite the same. They jumped at shadows. They avoided the crossroads where the lantern lay buried, and they spoke in whispers of Josiah Crane, the man who had carried his damnation in his hand, whose fate was to burn forever in service to something that was neither devil nor God but something in between. Margaret Flynn sold her general store within a year and moved to Tucson, unable to sleep in the room where she had heard those footsteps pacing overhead. Father Michael requested a transfer to a parish in California, writing in his petition that his work in Esperanza was complete, though everyone knew he simply could not bear to remain in a place where his faith had been so thoroughly tested. Dutch Henry disappeared into the desert one spring morning and was never seen again, though some claimed to see a light in the mountains at night, a small flame that moved through the darkness as if searching for something it could never find. The settlement of Esperanza itself lasted another decade before being abandoned entirely. The silver that men hoped to find in the Dragoon Mountains never materialized in sufficient quantity to justify the hardship of life in that place. One by one, families packed their possessions and left for easier country. The buildings fell into disrepair. The well went dry. The cemetery was reclaimed by desert sage and mesquite, and eventually, even the name was forgotten, becoming just another ghost town in a territory full of them. But the stories persisted. They were told around campfires and in saloons, in church basements, and around family tables. They changed with each telling, details added or removed, names altered or forgotten, until what remained was a kind of parable about the cost of obsession, about the danger of making bargains with forces beyond human understanding. Some versions claimed that Josiah Crane had been a Confederate soldier who sold his soul for the power to survive the war. Others said he was a prospector who found something in a mine that no human was meant to find. Still others insisted he was not a man at all but a demon or spirit who had taken human form to walk among the living. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complex than any of these tales. Josiah Crane had been a man, nothing more and nothing less, but a man who had made a choice that echoed across the boundary between the living and the dead. In the winter of 1864, during the final terrible months of the Civil War, he had been part of a cavalry unit that became lost in the mountains of Tennessee. Snow had fallen for 3 days without stopping. Supplies had run out. Men had begun to freeze to death in the night, and those who survived cannibalized their horses and then, when the horses were gone, considered darker alternatives. On the 4th night, when Crane believed he would not see another dawn, something had spoken to him from the darkness beyond the fire. It had no voice in the conventional sense, but he heard it nonetheless, felt it in his bones like the memory of warmth. It offered him a bargain, his life in exchange for service, light in exchange for souls. He would carry a flame that would never go out, and that flame would guide him through any darkness, protect him from any danger, lead him always to safety. But he must feed the flame. He must bring it what it desired, and what it desired was the essence of human hope, the small spark that keeps a person alive even in the worst circumstances. Crane had accepted. He had not believed, not really, but desperate men will grasp at any lifeline, even one woven from madness and delusion. Yet when morning came, he found beside him a lantern that had not been there before, its flame burning bright despite the wind and snow. His companions saw it too. They asked where he had gotten it, how he had hidden it from them, and he had no answer. They followed that light out of the mountains, and everyone who did survived. Everyone who stayed behind was found weeks later, frozen in postures of despair. For 3 years, Crane had carried that lantern across the ruined landscape of Reconstruction America. He had drifted west with the other lost souls, seeking a place where the past did not matter and questions were not asked. And he had fed the flame as promised, though he did not understand at first what he was doing. Wherever he stayed, people began to lose their hope. They stopped dreaming. They stopped believing in tomorrow. A darkness settled over them, invisible but palpable, and when it became unbearable, Crane would move on, leaving behind a community of hollow-eyed men and women who went through the motions of living but felt nothing, cared for nothing, hoped for nothing. By the time he reached Arizona territory, Crane knew what he had become. He understood that the flame in his lantern was not fueled by oil but by something he stole from everyone he encountered, something precious and irreplaceable. He had tried to extinguish it, tried to abandon it, tried to destroy it, but the lantern always returned to his hand, always continued burning. It was part of him now, or he was part of it. The distinction had ceased to matter. In Esperanza, he had made one final attempt to break the bargain. He had gone into the caves in the Dragoon Mountains, seeking the source of the power that bound him, hoping to confront it or bargain with it or beg for release. What he found there, no living person knows. But when he emerged, something had changed. The flame burned brighter. His eyes had taken on that inhuman cast, and he knew with a certainty that crushed his remaining hope that there was only one way to end it. He had starved the flame. He had isolated himself, avoided contact with others, refused to let it feed. For weeks he had endured the hunger it imposed on him, a hunger that was spiritual rather than physical, a craving for connection and warmth that grew until it consumed every thought. The flame had dimmed slightly, weakened by his resistance, but it had not gone out. It could not go out, not while he lived. So Josiah Crane had made his final choice. On that frozen November night, in a room above a general store in a town that would soon cease to exist, he had given himself to the flame entirely. He had opened himself to it, let it consume not just his hope, but his very soul, fed it everything he was and everything he might have been. And in that moment of absolute surrender, he had achieved a kind of victory. The flame could not exist without a host. By giving it everything at once, he had broken the cycle. His body had died, but his essence remained trapped in the lantern, along with all the others who had made similar bargains through the centuries. A multitude of the damned burning in an eternal fire that required no fuel because it fed on itself. The old woman Esperanza had understood this when she looked into the flame and saw the faces. She had recognized in them the same expression she had seen in mirrors at certain moments of her long life. The expression of someone who has sacrificed everything for a moment of warmth, for a chance at survival, for the illusion of safety in an unsafe world. And she had spoken to the flame in the language of her grandmother's grandmother, words that acknowledged its power, but denied it permission to remain. And her words had been enough to sever its connection to this place, if not to end its existence. The lantern still lies beneath that crossroads, buried with the others who carried it before Crane and the others who perhaps carry it still, in different times and different places. The flame may be dark or may yet burn, hidden from human eyes but waiting for someone desperate enough or foolish enough to dig. The desert keeps its secrets well, and the crossroads is unmarked now, the white stones scattered or buried by decades of wind and rain. But sometimes travelers on lonely roads in the desert southwest report seeing a light in the distance, small and steady, beckoning like a promise of shelter or warmth. Those who follow it find nothing, or find more than they bargained for. And those who know the old stories, who remember the warnings passed down through generations, they turn away from such lights and make their own way through the darkness, understanding that some fires offer no real warmth, that some lights lead only to greater darkness, and that the price of a moment's comfort can be an eternity of burning. The records of Esperanza are scattered now, dispersed among archives in Tucson and Phoenix and Washington, D.C. Most have been lost to fire or flood or simple neglect. But among those that remain, there exists a letter written by Margaret Flynn to her sister in St. Louis dated December 1867. In it, she describes the events of that November with a clarity that suggests the writing was therapeutic, an attempt to expel the horror through documentation. She ends the letter with a warning that has since become a proverb among those who study the stranger tales of the American frontier. She writes, "Beware the light that burns when it should not, the flame that asks nothing but gives less. For every bargain made in darkness carries a cost that extends beyond the grave, and some debts can never be fully paid. We bury our sins and our sorrows, but the earth is not deep enough to hold them forever." What we plant in secret will rise in its season, and the harvest is always bitter. The letter was never answered. Margaret Flynn died 6 months after writing it. Of causes, the death certificate lists as natural, though those who knew her said she simply stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped wanting to live. She was buried in Tucson's municipal cemetery, and her grave marker makes no mention of Esperanza or the events that drove her from it. Just her name, her dates, and the inscription at rest, though whether she found rest or merely another kind of burning, no one can say. Father Michael fared somewhat better, at least in the conventional sense. He served parishes throughout California for another 30 years, built churches and schools, ministered to the sick and dying, and was by all accounts a good and faithful priest. But those who knew him well noted that he avoided candles when possible, preferring the clear light of day or the darkness of night to anything in between. And in his final illness, delirious with fever, he was heard to speak of flames and faces, of a lantern that would not go out, of souls burning in service to something that was neither devil nor God, but older than both. Dutch Henry's fate remains unknown. Some say he found gold in the mountains and died defending it from claim jumpers. Others claim he returned to the cave where he had followed Josiah Crane, seeking whatever power the man had found there, and never emerged. And there are those who swear they have seen him on desert roads at dusk, an old man carrying a brass lantern, offering light to travelers who have lost their way. Though whether this is mercy or malice, charity or trap, the storytellers do not agree. The crossroads where the lantern was buried has been paved over now, incorporated into a state highway that connects small towns and mining operations across southeastern Arizona. Thousands of vehicles pass over it every day, their drivers unaware of what lies beneath the asphalt and gravel. But occasionally, usually on the coldest nights of winter when the desert temperature drops below freezing, the pavement at that spot grows warm. Ice melts in a perfect circle, and travelers stopped for repairs or rest report feeling watched, though when they look around they see nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon. The Dragoon Mountains still rise against the sky, their peaks cutting sharp silhouettes at sunset. The caves where Josiah Crane sought his answers remain, though they are now fenced off and marked with warnings about unstable rock formations and dangerous wildlife. Hikers who ignore these warnings sometimes report strange phenomena. They hear voices in languages they do not understand. They see lights deep in the tunnels, small flames that move with purpose. They feel drawn forward, compelled to explore, to search, to find what surely must be waiting at the end of the passage. Most resist this compulsion and return to the surface with stories they later dismiss as products of oxygen deprivation or overactive imagination. But some do not return. Every few years, the authorities conduct searches for missing hikers in the Dragoons, deploying dogs and helicopters and volunteers with radios. Usually they find nothing. Sometimes they find remains, scattered and gnawed by scavengers, impossible to identify, carrying no clues about what drew the deceased into the mountains or what they found there. The thing that spoke to Josiah Crane in the winter of 1864, that offered him light and warmth and survival in exchange for service, that thing is patient. It does not measure time as humans do. It can wait decades or centuries for the right soul, the right circumstances, the right alignment of desperation and opportunity. It has waited before. It will wait again. And eventually, inevitably, someone will come seeking what it offers, will make the bargain that seems so reasonable in the moment, will take up the lantern and carry it forward into the world. This is the nature of such powers. They do not die. They do not sleep. They simply persist, burning in the darkness, offering light to those who have lost their way. And the light they offer is real. It will guide you through any storm, protect you from any danger, keep you warm through the coldest night. The price is only everything you are and everything you might become, a small price to pay for survival, or so it seems until the bill comes due. The people of Esperanza learned this truth at a cost that broke their community and scattered its members across the continent. They learned that some frontiers are marked with warnings for good reason, that some boundaries exist to protect us from ourselves, and that the things we find in the darkness are sometimes better left unfound. They learned that desperation makes poor counsel, and that the bargains we make in our darkest hours echo across our lives and beyond them. But most importantly, they learned that a light which burns without fuel is burning something invisible, something vital, something that cannot be replaced once consumed. They learned that hope is not infinite, that it can be drained and stolen and fed to flames that care nothing for human suffering. And they learned to be wary of anyone who offers easy answers in hard times, who promises safety without cost, who carries a light that never dims. These lessons were bought with blood and madness and the destruction of a community. Whether they will be remembered long enough to prevent the next bargain, the next burning, the next soul consumed by a hunger older than history, remains to be seen. The desert forgets nothing, but humans forget everything given time. And time is the one resource that entities like the one that spoke to Josiah Crane have in abundance. So the lantern waits beneath the crossroads, patient and eternal. And somewhere in America, perhaps in Arizona or perhaps in some other desert place, someone is approaching their moment of greatest need. Someone is facing a darkness they cannot navigate alone. Someone is desperate enough to make any bargain, to grasp at any hope, no matter how suspect its source. And when that moment comes, when desperation reaches its peak and reason fails, they will hear a voice in the darkness. It will offer them light. It will promise them survival. It will show them a flame that burns bright and steady, asking only that they carry it forward, feed it what it requires, serve it as others have served it through the centuries. Some will refuse. Some will recognize the trap for what it is and turn away, choosing the honest darkness over false light. But others will accept. They will take up the lantern. They will feel its warmth and believe themselves saved. And they will carry it forward into the world, believing themselves blessed when in fact they are cursed, believing themselves survivors when in fact they are already consumed. This is how the pattern repeats. This is how the hunger is fed. This is how the flame continues to burn, long after its original host has crumbled to dust, long after witnesses have died and stories have faded into legend. The lantern does not need to be believed in. It does not need to be remembered. It only needs to be found once every generation or so, by someone desperate enough to ignore the warnings written in blood and ash by those who came before. And so it waits, and so it burns, and so the cycle continues, as inexorable as the seasons, as certain as death. The desert wind blows across the crossroads, scattering sand over the pavement, and beneath that pavement, beneath the layers of stone and earth, something that was never alive and can never die maintains its vigil, waiting for the next fool, waiting for the next bargain, waiting for the next soul to feed into its eternal flame. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. Coyotes call to each other across the empty miles, and in a grave that holds no body, in a darkness that is absolute and eternal, Josiah Crane burns. His face is one of hundreds now, perhaps thousands, layered within the flame like pages in a book of the damned. He cannot speak. He cannot scream. He can only burn, fuel, and fire at once, his essence consumed and consuming in an endless cycle that knows no mercy and allows no escape. This was his choice and his punishment. This was the price of warmth in winter, of light in darkness, of survival when death seemed certain. And this is the warning that echoes down through the years, carried in stories and dreams, and the collective memory of a land that has seen too much suffering to forget. Some fires burn without fuel, some lights lead into darkness, and some bargains once made can never be unmade, only endured for eternity. The lantern that kept burning 2 days after its owner was buried burns still, in ways that transcend the physical, in realms beyond the reach of earth or water or human understanding. It waits for you. It waits for me. It waits for anyone foolish enough or desperate enough to believe that survival at any cost is the same as salvation. And when the next traveler stumbles across it, when the next soul makes the bargain and takes up the burden, the cycle will continue, as it has continued since before the first human kindled the first fire and stared into the flames and wondered what looked back.